The one salient message that I can send out to anybody who does this kind of work is don't be afraid to talk to each other. And that can be a heavy lift sometimes.
For this episode, I welcome Deputy Superintendent Susan Schiller. Susan Schiller holds the rank of Deputy Superintendent for Boston Emergency Medical Services, or Boston EMS, and has over 30 years of experience as a critical care medic and clinical researcher. Welcome, Deputy Superintendent Schiller.
Hello. It's great to be here.
Great to have you, and I'm excited to have you on board. We've been longtime friends and colleagues, and I have a great deal of respect for everything that you do and your expertise in what we're going to talk about today, which is discussing and planning for large-scale events. And I wanted to take a little bit of a unique kind of perspective on this, and so we're going to set the stage to discuss a particular event that I always enjoy, which is 4th of July in Boston, and a little bit about my personal experience so that we can then expand on kind of your experience for getting ready for these large-scale events. Does that sound like fun?
Sounds like great. Sounds
great.
Perfect.
Great. So for those of you who are outside of the U.S., 4th of July is Independence Day in the United States. It's a big celebration, especially here in Boston, where we consider ourselves having been at the root of independence for the United States. 4th of July is also the date of my daughter Emma's birthday. And so it's always been a special day for me and a special time. I've always been able to celebrate 4th of July, for the most part, in the city, which hosts a really incredible event that is free for all. It involves a very large gathering of people along what's called the Charles River, extending through Boston and Cambridge and adjacent cities. At the center of this all is a stage called the Hat Shell, where the Boston Pops eventually play a concert for those attendees. And so I wanted to give a little bit of background because this is a pretty large-scale event in an already large city. So, Susan, what's your experience been with the 4th of July, and what kind of things do you think about as you prep for an event of this size?
Oh boy. Well, so the first thing I should probably say right from the jump is the 4th of July for us, certainly, and I would imagine for any public safety agency, begins way before the 4th of July and continues even after it. So I think when you think about preparing for large-scale events, mass gatherings, anything where you expect a crowd surge, as it were, you have to consider early multidisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional planning, because no one agency, no one department can do this on their own. And I think the better communication you have between agencies, departments, bureaus, the police, fire, EMS, park services, Department of Public Works, sanitation, all of these services, local vendors. I mean, obviously, Boston depends on all of the local businesses that have food trucks and pop-up stands to feed a crowd of a quarter to half to 750,000 people at any one time. It crosses over both city and state law enforcement lines. So you can imagine we have to sit down and start discussing these rather large plans, to say nothing of security involved after 2001. So all of this takes a lot of coordinated effort and planning, which begins, quite frankly, 2 weeks after the July 4th for this year. We start planning for the next one, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And to give people a little bit more background, a lot of people, myself included, would actually line up the night before to get a good space. There's an area that's enclosed around the Hat Shell, and I'm not sure how many people does that enclosed area fit? Do you know what the
So the
approximate volume of
actual
that?
the actual hat shell itself,
Yeah.
I actually wouldn't guess, because what people have to understand is the hat shell is an open air stadium, an open air stage, really, as you described it, that is on a peninsula that is bordered by a main thoroughfare. And what happens, as you well know, Steve, for this particular event is that thoroughfare is shut down. So you might have, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 people in front of the hat shell for a Shakespeare performance or for one of the many free musical performances during the summer. But when you shut down the road and allow people to completely engulf the entire area, you can easily have 500,000 people that are at the event. And I do think it's also important, as we go on, to recognize how we used to plan and prep has changed over the years as security has required to get tighter. I'm sure when you first came to your first event, you had a cooler that you were rolling in, and people just pretty much showed up on the lawn, sat down, and camped out for 12 or 15 hours. But unfortunately, the world being what it is now, we are required to have much tightened security. So people don't show up in the same way, because nobody is going to stand out in the street for 10 hours in order to get onto the venue. So I have noticed a serious shift in the way in which people approach the event, and certainly the way in which we plan, in order to make sure that it is safe as well as enjoyable.
No, yeah, it has changed. As I mentioned, I've been going since I was a kid, and then after I had my daughter Emma, and we decided that we're going to camp out and make it a special event. My brother and I used to be able to bring a cooler, and we brought
Right.
all sorts of equipment, and you could sleep out overnight, and
Exactly.
it felt very safe to do so. And then as times have changed, that's no longer feasible, and now I don't think you can
It's
actually bring anything.
unfortunate. Yeah, it's unfortunate that Emma won't have that same experience,
Yeah,
But
yeah,
there are other things that that make up for it. So we hope that on
exactly.
balance, it's still an enjoyable event.
Exactly. So let's just talk about, yeah. So that area, as I mentioned, you can get up to, as you mentioned, hundreds of thousands of people in this kind of enclosed area, and then outside of that enclosed area, there's hundreds of thousands more people spread across, the river and throughout the event. For the area, the hat shell, where there's 100,000 people, it's enclosed by fences. What kind of planning, what kind of things do you need to think about for medical services to provide, for that particular spot, that area? And then we'll talk about how you provide kind of for the, other areas of the event as well.
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting because one of the primary goals of us planning for a mass gathering is to try and mitigate surge at the hospitals. So a lot of the planning that we do is to make sure if we have ill or injured people at the event, we can actually treat and release. Is what we call treat and release right at the event. And we go through quite an extensive process of setting up fully contained, if you will, MASH tents that have physicians on scene that allow us to treat and monitor anyone. And only the sickest or the serious of our injuries will then get transported to the hospital. Because what we don't want to do is burden the city of Boston and the hospital system that it includes with patients that don't actually need to be in an emergency room. So a lot of our planning goes to that. Also, a lot of our planning goes to the what we call the what if factor. If the weather isn't beautiful and things don't go off without a hitch, what are all our Plan B and Plan C protocols so that we can readily evacuate 500,000 people, readily shelter 500,000 people, feed, clothe, and provide sanitary facilities for 500,000 people. a lot of that goes into it. And then, of course, depending on what the weather is projected, if the weather is projected to be very, very hot, we have a whole hyperthermia protocol that kicks into place. And if we're expecting cooler temperatures or potentially rain, we have other protocols that kick into place. So all of these types of contingencies go into our planning.
And so basically, you're erecting a whole nother hospital system within a system, a whole new
that is a good way of
hospital.
putting it. That is a good way of putting it. Correct.
And that's, I think, incredibly important to really offload that burden on an already burdened system, to make sure that, this event doesn't burden those hospitals. And I think, I've seen that as a failing for many other large, scale events, in that a lot of people are being transported from that setting to the hospitals. And so you're taking an already, a system that already has high volumes of patients that really can't handle a surge. And then you're surging them on top of it. And it really creates some chaos. Yeah. So that seems
now,
like
especially with COVID being a driver of high hospital capacity, it's even more at our forefront.
Right. And if you just had to give an estimate, how many patients do you think you see through that system during that event on average?
July 4th. So I would say, I'd have to look at hard numbers, but I would say Alpha Tent probably sees, 20 or 30 patients. So we have five medical tents that are set up throughout the venue. And part of the big planning that we plan for is our inability to make our way quickly through a crowd of 500,000 to 1 million people. So we strategically set up aid stations so that nobody has to go through a large group of people if there is a serious emergency. Maybe a total of what we call patient contacts. I would say anywhere from 60 to 70 patient contacts. And that could be anyone from needing a Band-Aid, somebody needing a Tylenol, somebody needing an asthma treatment, they forget their inhaler, all the way up to somebody having trouble breathing, somebody having chest pain, somebody falling and breaking an ankle, any of those things. Now, obviously, somebody who breaks an ankle is going to go to the hospital. We can't fix that on scene. But we can take care of the more minor stuff, such as Tylenol distribution, albuterol distribution, a diabetic who hasn't eaten and can't get to a ice cream fast enough. All of those kinds of things we can easily take care of. And we have a full cardiac monitoring station. If somebody is having dizziness or some other complaint that you want to rule out a cardiac event, we can work that up. We have a little bit less capacity at July 4th than we have at, say, the Boston Marathon, because the marathon, we are expecting medical compromise, clinical compromise from running a race. So we have more significant lab stations set up. And that's run through the Boston Athletic Association. But with the July 4th, we are expecting it to be more of a party, and we don't really anticipate nearly as many people to come and request services. We're really there for the oh my goodness, something bad happens contingency.
Right. And I think you'd be hard pressed not to find an ice cream truck if you're a diabetic. I know that.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Although I don't know that an ice cream truck is the best thing for a diabetic, but again, it is difficult because people can't bring in big picnic lunches in the way that they used to be able to. So that's part of the preparation that public safety has to have. EMS being part of that, in that we have to expect people aren't going to bring in big bottles of water and big containers, although it does help cut down on the alcohol. So I suppose that's a good thing. But I would say maybe we have a dozen to do dozen actual clinical transports to a hospital over the course of the whole day. But the majority of the patients that we see, we're able to address. And again, that's the planning part of it. It's expecting what we might get and then being able to address it right then and there.
And I think that exactly that speaks to the amount of preparation that you take to make sure that you are addressing the issues at hand.
Correct.
So to that end, let's talk a little bit about communications, because I think, again, for a lot of people planning for these large scale events, communication is where I usually start thinking about. That's where I start the plan when I'm thinking about these kind of programs. But I think it's can be something that some people overlook. And as you mentioned, you're talking about multi-jurisdictional communications. And there's not only Boston EMS there, but there's also some private EMS agencies in the area, and even some local fire departments that may be involved. How do you think about communications for these large events? And are there any lessons learned that you can bring to our listeners about either successes or failures in the realm of communication for these kind of large scale events?
Absolutely. The one salient message that I can send out to anybody who does this kind of work is, don't be afraid to talk to each other. And that can be a heavy lift sometimes, especially when you are dealing with operational security issues. Law enforcement has their own concerns, which we completely respect. But at some point, there has to be an understanding that if you have a stakeholder buy-in, you have a better event. And I would send out, you are correct. Obviously, Boston is a big city with a very large population. And we have mutual aid partners who we rely on, who are fabulous. We use Boston Fire Department as force multipliers, who are fabulous. We depend on Mass State Police and Boston Police and the Park Service and Transit Police to assist us as well, and are equally fabulous. But no matter what agency what agency you're involved with, no matter who you are, how small or how big, ask yourself, who has skin in the game? If something goes wrong, who needs to be a part of the conversation? And that includes, how do people get to and leave from an event, right? Those people have to be involved. For Boston, it might be the MBTA. For a small town, it might be something else. It might be cabs. It might be Uber. It might be, a bus system. Whatever it is, they should have an idea, because there's going to be surges of people going in and out of those, what we call pinch points, during a large gathering. Who cleans up after the event, right? You can't leave the lawn completely filthy. So they need to be at the table. Now, they may not necessarily have as much communication with the EMS services, but when you start planning these kinds of events, all of those types of people really have to be involved. Police, fire, EMS, that's obvious. Those are the easy ones to be involved. The ones that aren't so easy are the vendors. How do we feed 500,000 people? Or if you're a small town of 10,000, how do you feed 5,000 people? How do you provide drink? If it's a hot day, how do we hydrate people, right? You can't have, even if you have 10,000 people on a lawn for a July 4th party, if you don't make arrangements to have somewhere for them to use the bathroom, you're going to run into problems. So these are things that people who are planning these events need to consider. Because honestly, if you set the framework well, then the rest will follow. Everybody worries about, what happens if the bomb goes off? And yes, of course, that's important. But that takes training well beyond 3 or 4 or 6 months. That takes a system-wide training, day by day, with good clinical care, good clinical judgment, because then when the catastrophe happens, everybody knows how to kick into gear. But the rather large gathering, to make sure that everybody stays safe, is, how do we get people in safely? How do we get people out safely? If there is, God forbid, a mass shooting, or even if there's a report, it doesn't have to actually be a shooting for there to be a stampede. I mean, good God, the terrible nightmare that happened over Halloween where 160 children were killed. That was a tragedy. And that comes from not recognizing you can't get 10,000 people through a space that's made to get 10 people through. So all of these things have to be thought out and communicated. And your question was about communication, which is to say they have to be spoken about and discussed and decided on with all those people that are going to be involved in the incident. The earlier you do it, the better you do it. There is a fine line between communicating too early as plans change and not getting the information out. And I would say, certainly amongst high-level policy makers, high-level stakeholders, those conversations be happening months in advance of a large-scale event. As you get closer to the event and the plans are solidified, then I think it is very important to start talking to your either middle managers or tactical commanders, whatever your system is set up to employ, because they need to be aware of what the plan is shaping up and forming to be. And at a very minimum, the field people, the individuals tasked with carrying out the plan need to have it 7 days in advance. And even if there are going to be tiny little tweaks at the end, that's okay. Roster tweaks are fine. But the actual plan should be gelled up, hardened, and out to the field folks a week in advance, because that gives them time to then turn to their immediate supervisor, their immediate commanders, and say, I don't understand this. What am I supposed to do? If you hand out a plan the morning of an event, there's going to be confusion. I am a big fan of full briefings prior to any event, either at the venue or at deployment, wherever your folks muster. That has to happen. That's for the chief or the deputy chief or the commanders at each zone to go over. These are the highlights. These are the last minute changes to the plan. This is the updates to the evacuation because we may get lightning. All of those things happen at the actual briefing of the event. But communication of the operational plan, maps, points of access and egress, where you have lost children, where are the facilities, where is security? If it's a smaller venue and you only have one law enforcement agency, who's the lead for that? Telephone numbers, very important. And the other thing that I would recommend is, speaking of communication, it's not only internal communication. There should be, the bigger the agency you are, a designated telephone number for external members to be able to contact their people on the ground. One thing that we learned from the marathon bombing was the first thing our communication system got flooded by is family members calling looking for their people that are on duty. So there should be a separate designated number for folks that are working a big event so that people can call and get information immediately, because if we don't take care of our own, we can't take care of anyone else.
Oh, that's incredibly important. Yeah. And I think that's something I don't think most people would put in their plan, which would be, how do family of the providers, boots on the ground, get in contact? I think that's vitally important, and good lesson learned, it sounds, from that event.
Yeah, absolutely. And ever since then, we always have, in big events, we always have, this is the number that you call in case you need to contact somebody who's at the event. That's great.
We mentioned police, fire, parks, and rec. What are some of the other non-traditional organizations that you think are oftentimes overlooked but can be helpful in these events? I'm thinking about transit. I'm thinking about Department of Public Works. Are there any other kind of non-traditional, kind of partners that you can think of that
Sure.
have really been helpful in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say, using the July 4th as a frame of reference, the Community Boating Organization, which is a private community organization that does sailing on the Charles River. And for those people who are not familiar where the Hatch Shell is located, I'm sorry, I don't know if you had said it at the top of the hour. The Hatch Shell is on, like I said, a peninsula, which is bordered one side by the Charles River, which is water, obviously, and the other side by this expressway, the Starrow Drive. So those folks that are expert and knowledgeable about the Charles River and have the logistical support, such as boats, to navigate those waters, they're incredibly helpful if we need them. So get them involved in the planning. If you are in a community where there's private land, I mean, certainly tribal organizations that might be bordering a venue in a public space, get them involved, because anybody who has expertise bordering the event might be helpful if you have emergencies that are going on inside the event. Who else? So I'm a big fan of getting community involvement. Now, July 4th is not quite so necessary for faith organizations because, again, everybody's coming together, having a good time. It's a big party. I wouldn't say that. But in general, if you're planning for a mass gathering, it's not a bad idea to have community leaders involved so that they can message out. If you have a community that has multiple languages, get those people that speak those languages involved so that they can get messaging out. Because again, you solve half of your problem if people know how to get in, how to get out, what to do in an emergency. If you can get that messaging out before the event, that's one less thing you have to do when the emergency actually happens. So I would say look to those community leaders, those community organizations, Boys and Girls Club. Again, they're not going to be involved in the actual planning of the event, but they would certainly be involved in the communication out. Now, in Boston, we have a pretty expansive Office of Emergency Management. We have a very extensive coordinated network with the mayor's office. So we already have those plans in place, whereby the mayor is fabulous about getting out the information to the communities. This is what you can bring in. This is what you can't bring in. This is the security measures. But if you're in a smaller community, those are the things that you might want to think about.
No, I think that's great advice, and engaging as many organizations as you can to really just make that, that event smooth, get the right information out to people. It's imperative for sure. So let's talk. I'm going to go back to, again, set the stage for a personal experience. I've been lucky, knock on wood, that for many, many years we had wonderful weather. But one year we did have a big thunderstorm, thunder and lightning, which created a significant amount of panic. And I actually remember calling you, I think, a day or two later to kind of ask you this question. You had us all, we all had to evacuate into not the river, thankfully. As you mentioned, it's bordered by a river, so we didn't have to go into the river, but we all evacuated into the expressway. And this expressway has a variety of different tunnels.
Right.
And, so we all evacuated into these tunnels and stayed nice and dry, and the party carried on. But I had a question as to, if there's an event that happens inside of one of those tunnels, how do you know where people are, and how do people identify where they are, especially people that aren't familiar with the city? They're going to say, well, I'm in a tunnel. I don't know what else to tell you. So how did that come to fruition, and how did you solve that problem of, this kind of evacuation point and knowing how to account for people in that evacuation point?
Right. So I think it's important that we define how you account for people. So from an agency perspective, our folks all have a very high level radio system. So we all are in constant communication with each other. And there is a roster that goes out at the beginning of the event. Every commander, and we break our systems up into zones, and those zones are identified by a map that has grids, and it's in a way, can think of it as longitude and latitude, and everybody knows exactly where they are and exactly what their area is, and you can look on the map and say, I'm at B7, or I'm at A14, or I'm at C3, and everybody knows where that area is. And those evacuation tunnels that you describe are located in certain parts of the grid that we're all familiar with, again, because communicating the plan out early let us know where those evacuation tunnels were. And we knew that the zone commander A was responsible for Tunnel A, which was located in this grid area. Zone Commander B was responsible for that, and so on and so forth. So if something happens in Zone B, in or out of the tunnel, the commander there is responsible to transmit that information and then get assistance. We don't necessarily know who physically the general public is in those areas. We don't keep track of people in that regard. But if an event happens, we can direct our units into the specific area that we're at. Does that answer your question, how we identify?
Yeah.
I think any big event that covers more than, I would say, line of sight, quite frankly, anything bigger than line of sight events should have a map with either physical locations written down where everybody knows it, or a grid map. And the bigger it is, the more important a grid becomes. And if I make it sound like this is all very smooth, it's not. We will often full disclosure, I don't want everybody thinking, oh, they have it all put together. As the old saying goes, no plan survives first engagement. We struggle as well with, is that a repeat call? Is that the same caller? Units, can you verify that you're on scene with the second patient? No, it's only one patient. It happens all the time. You just have to roll with it and do your best. And that's why we drill so often with using grid points, because it cuts down on some of that confusion.
Yeah. And you brought up another good point, which is that you drill these things. How important is, practicing these things prior to the event, and what kind of, things do you do to prepare for these kind of major scale events? I mean, we have the Boston Marathon, you have 4th of July, even first night, not as big as New York City, but, these are all major events. You don't want to say, oh, well, you did a great job last year, I'm sure we'll do great next year. What are some things that you do as preparation? How do you train for these kind of large scale events?
So ideally, an agency or an organization would have the ability to train regularly. And by that, I mean setting up and drilling and practicing. Those agencies like Boston that are actually very busy, that have a lot of large scale events, we have built in drilling because we actually do it in real life. That said, you can never practice enough because nothing is ever perfect. So if you work for an organization or an agency that doesn't do any large events, then it is vitally imperative that you plan one, you build it in, you simulate an event so that your teams can practice. If you work for a mid or large scale agency, while it's not as important because you can practice it as you do it, it's always beneficial to get more experience. I am a big fan of HCEP, which is the mnemonic in Homeland Security for operational planning and drilling and evaluating. It gets more complex and complicated the more thin our ranks become. Everybody knows healthcare and certainly EMS is critically understaffed. And I know from personal experience, we struggle with being able to meet our standard operating needs and allowing people release time for drilling. But when you can do it, do it. It's always helpful.
No, I agree. And it also helps you find those things that you may think have been planned really well, but in actuality, when you try to actualize that plan, isn't going to work. That gives you that kind of safe space to then, kind of reactualize that plan and not have to do it real time.
Correct.
Which is important.
And, as hard as drilling is, I encourage people to do it as realistically as possible. So if you're going to have 3 or 4 agencies involved, try and get those 3 or 4 agencies to drill together. If you only drill with your own small team, then when it comes time to integrate into a larger plan, it can get a little bit, wait, we worked so well when we drilled it. What happened? Well, what happened is you introduced a variable that wasn't at the drill, so you didn't necessarily know how to address it. It obviously gets more difficult the more people that are involved. And some agencies, yes, I'll come, but then they can't, understandably. But perfect scenario would be to train as you fight and fight as you train. That's the mantra.
That's a good mantra to stick with for sure. So, so this has given us a really good kind of overview of some of the things to think about for preparing for, kind of large scale events, from communication, which organizations to engage, as well as how to distribute that plan. I think maps are incredibly important, and rethinking, how you distribute, that information as well. Anything that, in your experience, and you have over 30 years of experience doing this, that has gone exceptionally well, something that you're like, we planned for this and it just went exceptionally well because we planned. Any particular event or moment that you can think of?
At the risk of saying what folks around the world have said, I think the Boston Marathon bombings is the pinnacle of, I don't want to say performance, but example. It is the reason that Boston did as well as we did was because we were prepared for it. And there was no small part of luck that was involved. I think anybody who doesn't acknowledge that is not being fair to other systems that haven't had as much success at a big event. We had a lot of things going in our favor, not the least of which our mass casualty system was set up because we were prepared. And all we did was shift from what we consider a mass gathering event to a mass casualty event. That's really the only switch that was flipped. But the reason we were able to do that so quickly and so fluidly was because we train all the time, and we plan for it, and we drill for it. So when I say drill, it comes from personal experience and knowing how that works.
Yeah. No, and I think, that's been widely recognized as one of the events that, was incredibly unfortunate, but also the amount of lives saved and the expert, response to that is basically kind of what sets the standard for, for how to react to these types of events. And as you mentioned, it wasn't that you just were able to flip a switch. You had planned for it and drilled it and planned it and drilled it, planned it and drilled it. And, that's why we were able to have such a wonderful response to that.
Exactly. I guess in a way, what you can say is Boston pre-installs that switch.
Right.
so it's ready when you need it.
Right. It's ready when ready when you need it. And then
I just want to add for those folks out there who work for much smaller agencies who say, oh, we don't have that many calls and we can't possibly do this. You can drill every day. You go to a car accident with 3 or 4 patients, get your head in an MCI mode, plan for, I only have two EMTs and I've got 4 patients. How do I handle this? That's technically an MCI because your patients overwhelm your resources. If you practice that, you set that up, you do that on a daily basis, you'd be surprised at how often you can I don't want to say play, but you can practice. You can practice this behavior.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, and we used to do this. As you know, I worked for Boston MedFlight in the air medical realm, and one of the things that you see in aviation is they're constantly drilling and planning. Even on a flight home, they say, "Oh, what would we do if we lost an engine?" And then you go through that. You're just on your way back to base, and sometimes you're like, I just want to get back and finish my paperwork. But thinking, okay, each call, what am I going to do if? What would I do if I had to do a surgical airway on this patient, even though they're safely intubated? What would I need to do? And I think you can bring that same kind of thinking to, like you mentioned, everyday calls, so that when something happens, you're prepared for it.
Correct.
All right. Well, believe it or not, this went so quickly. We're running up against our time. I'd like to see if you have any last pearls you want to share with our listeners about this topic. And how to plan for mass gathering events?
The only I guess last comments I would have, pearls, if you will, is this is a team sport. Sometimes that can be hard, certainly for EMS providers who are so used to being autonomous fighters. We're given a lot of authority to make some pretty serious life and death decisions. And sometimes it can be hard for us to say, oh, we need the aid or assistance of other agencies, other people. But that is the only way to successfully do mass gatherings, large events. And that includes not only our own agencies, multiple units, multiple groups, but also multiple agencies, multiple jurisdictions. That is really what I have found throughout my career. That is what makes a successful event, is when everybody kind of comes together to make it a successful event.
Well, thank you so much for all that you do. You're just an integral part of the EMS system here in Boston, and you make you make that organization a wonderful organization with some of the best EMS professionals I've ever worked with. So I appreciate that. Yes, thank you for your valuable insight.
You are more than welcome anytime. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Deputy Superintendent Schiller from Boston EMS. We really appreciate you spending that time with us today. And if you enjoyed this podcast and have an interest in more topics like this, or just have an interest in medicine at the extremes, make sure to visit our website at worldextrememedicine.com, explore our webinars, our podcasts, our upcoming courses, as well as the array of other helpful content. Thank you all, and stay safe. And thank you, Doc. Thank you, Susan Schiller.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars and indeed a collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.